Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Bollocks. My name is Tim, and this is the first ever video on the channel. Tonight, we're going to be deconstructing a viral Twitter thread, which trots out many of the classic tropes of Holocaust denial and is pure, rarefied, and distilled history bollocks. Let's get into it. The thread is from a large account on Twitter called Uncommon Sense, which claims at least to be looking for the uncommon sense within America and amplifying it wherever found. However, I'm not convinced that this account is run by a first-language English speaker. Now, the thread is quite long, 16 tweets long, so grab yourself a pint and let's get ready for the deep dive. Tweet number 1 reads, "The Red Cross inspected Auschwitz in 1944 and found no evidence it was an extermination camp." The author references a letter from Jean-Étienne Schwarzenberg, the International Committee of the Red Cross officer in charge of Jewish issues, to a Mr. Roswell McClelland, an American Quaker activist and amateur diplomat. The letter's dated November 1944 and appears to be a response to a request for information regarding ICRC visits to Auschwitz. The referenced passage is fairly short, so I will read it in full. "Dear Mr. McClelland, in reply to your letter of November 17th, in which you asked us if a delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross had succeeded in visiting the camp at Auschwitz, we were able to supply you with the following information. It is a fact that one of our delegates was able to enter this camp. He approached the commandant with a view to arranging a scheme of possible relief consignments for the civilian prisoners there. According to his impression, the camp was a type of extensive concentration camp, where the detainees were compelled to do various kinds of work, including work outside the camp. Our delegate told us that he had not been able to discover any trace of installations for exterminating civilian prisoners. This fact corroborates a report which we had already received from other sources, i.e., that for several months past there had been no further exterminations at Auschwitz. At all events, this is not a camp containing exclusively Jews." Superficially, this document supports the tweeter's case, but he is clearly relying on most of his readers either having no background knowledge or simply failing to read the actual document. Here are a few problems. First is what the document actually says, and I quote, "For several months past, there had been no further exterminations at Auschwitz. Not only does this directly contradict the assertion by the tweeter, to say that there had been no further exterminations implies that there had indeed been exterminations, but it also accords precisely with the accepted historical record. The last selection, a mass murder at Auschwitz, took place on the 30th of October 1944. On the 1st of November, SS leader Heinrich Himmler ordered the extermination facilities destroyed. By the end of the month, i.e. by the time this letter was written, 4 of the 5 gas chamber crematorium complexes had been demolished with explosives." Lest I be accused of quibbling, it's important also that the tweeter's central claim that the Red Cross inspected Auschwitz in 1944 is also untrue. Now let's break this down just a little. The Schwarzenberg letter that the tweeter posts refers to a visit to Auschwitz I by junior ICRC officer Dr. Maurice Roussel, which produced a perfunctory report. Roussel is mainly known for his inspection of the Theresienstadt ghetto concentration camp in German-occupied Czechoslovakia, which by 1944 served as a transit point for mainly Western European Jews on their way to extermination further to the east. Dr. Roussel was given a carefully created tour of some of the facilities and unsurprisingly came away with exactly the impression that the Germans wanted him to have, noting merely that the camp seems to have been for privileged rather than ordinary Jewish detainees. There is some debate over the reasons why. Some claim that the ICRC was deliberately maintaining a state of institutional ignorance of the horrors being committed by the Nazi regime at Theresienstadt. For example, we know that the ICRC knew that Theresienstadt was not the final destination for Jews, contrary to their own reporting, and that they knew that many thousands were missing from the camp and had been sent further east, namely to Auschwitz. Others consider Roussel to have been naive. He was only 27 and had been with the ICRC a couple of months, or to have harboured the kind of casual anti-semitism that was common among the European ruling classes of the time. Either way, Dr. Roussel looked, but he did not see. Dr. Russell's visit to Auschwitz I in 1944 was different. It was not an inspection. He did not actually enter the camp. Even if he had done so, he would not have seen any evidence of extermination. Why? Because Auschwitz I was not an extermination camp, but a prison housing mainly Polish political prisoners. Mass exterminations took place at Auschwitz II-Birkenau, a far larger camp miles away. So, to conclude, not only does the tweeter misrepresent the plain words of the document he himself posted, but it's simply not true to say there was an inspection of the extermination centres of Auschwitz II-Birkenau, let alone any lack of evidence or evidence contrary to the historical record of exterminations having taken place at Auschwitz II-Birkenau. Let's have a look at the next tweet. I quote, "In 1988, American execution expert Fred Lucha examined the gas chambers at Auschwitz and had the walls chemically tested for Zyklon B residue. The results were negative." End quote. Here the tweeter puts the phrase gas chambers in scare quotes, gas chambers, but I would argue that a better use of scare quotes in this tweet would be the phrase execution expert. As here, we must delve more deeply into loony territory, for as the dog returneth to his vomit, so the Holocaust denier returneth to the Lucha report. Fred Lucha is one of the more interesting characters to have emerged from the global Holocaust denial industry. A trained historian, a self-taught engineer, Lucha carved out a niche for himself in the absurdly Byzantine world of American capital punishment, designing execution machines and protocols for their use. One strain of Holocaust denial is the claim that, whilst many outrages did occur up to and including mass murder, the large-scale gassing of Jews did not take place. Some versions of this nonsense claim merely that the gassing did not occur at Auschwitz. The facilities that purport to be gas chambers, or so the claim goes, are actually air raid shelters or post-war forgeries, or some similarly improbable claim. So, as a denialist movement, who better to have in your corner then than Fred Lucha, a disinterested expert in the science and technology of execution? Surely an air raid shelter or even a well-faked execution facility would be recognised immediately by such a man and easily debunked as such. The problem with that is that Fred Lucha is not disinterested, is not an expert, and in fact doesn't actually know anything about killing people beyond his work as a technologist involved with specific pieces of American execution equipment. Now, a word of advice. If your trade is bullshit, one of the worst possible places to ply it is in court, particularly as an expert witness, but that is exactly what the not particularly bright Mr. Lucha did. In 1985, Ernst Zundel, a German neo-Nazi activist and pamphleteer, was prosecuted by the Canadian Human Rights Commission for promoting hatred against Jews by publishing Holocaust denial tracts. Mr. Zundel commissioned Lucha to write a scientific report into the mass murders by poison gas at Auschwitz in order to defend himself from this accusation. Far from taking a cold hard look at the evidence, however, and going wherever it led him, Mr. Lucha set out to prove that homicidal gassings had not taken place in the Auschwitz gas chambers, contrary to basic scientific method. Let's start with one of the report's many claims. Now, a little background. Gassing with prussic acid, also known as hydrogen cyanide, can leave a residue called Prussian blue, a bright blue iron compound, if a surface is exposed to the gas in sufficient concentrations for long enough. Such stains can be seen in this photograph of the gas chambers at Majdanek concentration and extermination camp. Lucha inspected the gas chambers and delousing chambers at Auschwitz and found Prussian blue stains on the latter, but not on the former. To clarify, there are no Prussian blue stains in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Lucha then, without the permission of the Auschwitz Museum authorities, chipped samples away from the walls of the gas chambers with a chisel and had them analysed for prussic acid in the United States. The analysis found what Lucha describes as inconsequential traces of prussic acid, from which Lucha confirmed that homicidal gassings could not have taken place in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. So, No Prussian blue in the gas chambers and no significant residues of prussic acid detected by chemical analysis. So far, so superficially scientific, but this is where Lütjer's lack of expertise becomes really important. Prussian blue does not always form when prussic acid is used. Its appearance depends on a number of things, most particularly the length of time a surface is exposed to the gas and in what concentration. To Lütjer, the presence of Prussian blue in the delousing room and its absence from the gas chambers meant that the gas chambers could not have been such, but he misses a fundamental detail. It takes far more gas, used for far longer, to kill lice than to kill humans. To delouse clothes and bedding, a gas concentration of 16,000 parts per million for at least 20 hours is required. To kill human beings, it takes only 300 parts per million for a few minutes, a few gulps of air, and you're basically toast. So, of course, we see Prussian blue forming in the delousing chambers, but not in the gas chambers. Mr. Lütjer, because of his lack of expertise, did not know this, and it conclusively destroys his central thesis. Lütjer, as far as I can tell, never designed or advised on poison gas-based execution equipment, so his ability to build electric chairs or lethal injection machines is totally irrelevant. But Tim, I hear you cry, why then was Prussian blue found in the gas chambers at Majdanek? Well, young grasshopper, this is because the gas chambers at Majdanek were also used for delousing clothes. Further problems came with the samples that Mr. Lütjer illicitly gathered from the gas chambers. They were not of uniform thickness or gathered with any care for scientific integrity. The investigating laboratory was not given adequate information about what they were testing, and so they ground up the concrete plaster samples, mixed them with water, and tested the resulting emulsion. The technicians who performed the test later stated that the results were meaningless. The more eagle-eared amongst you will have noticed another problem. Lütjer dismissed the prussic acid detected in the samples from the gas chamber walls as inconsequential. If these rooms were not used for gassing, why was any prussic acid detected at all? A tiny reading accords with the historical record rather than contradicting it. In the 1990s, the Polish government authorities performed these chemical tests again and properly and got exactly the results you'd expect. Scientific confirmation that homicidal gassings had taken place in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. The Canadian courts naturally picked up on Lütjer's bullshit and his supposed expertise was dismissed accordingly. I am not a credentialist as such, but engineer is a meaningful term, and most countries regulate its use. Lütjer is not a qualified engineer. He made a number of false claims in court, including that his alma mater, Boston University, did not offer engineering courses during his time there. In fact, it offered 3. His nonsense also got him into hot water in Massachusetts, when in 1991 he was prosecuted for falsely presenting himself as an engineer. Bizarrely, Lütjer has stated that his degree in history qualifies him to operate as an engineer. I also studied history, but I'd counsel against driving across any bridge I'd designed. The Canadian courts refused to hear Lütjer's testimony on prussic acid and its effects on the human body on the related grounds that Lütjer was not a toxicologist or in any way qualified as a medic, and that he had never worked with poison gas in his capacity as an execution technician. Similarly, Lütjer's attempt to give evidence on cremation was dismissed. These are just a few criticisms that can be made of the Lütjer report and the man personally. A full debunking is a topic for a dedicated video, but I'm constantly surprised that Holocaust deniers still trot out this entirely nonsensical document. Let's have a look at tweet number 3. I quote, "Alan Turing and British intelligence had cracked the German Enigma code by 1942, meaning that they could intercept and read German messages at Auschwitz when spying. They recorded no evidence of Auschwitz being a death camp." Now, this is technically true. I know of no Enigma intercepts that talk of mass killings at Auschwitz, but it's a bit of a red herring for 2 reasons. Number 1, The Allies knew about mass killings from various sources, including the Polish underground and the Polish government in exile. And number two, British intelligence did indeed intercept coded messages from Auschwitz, which spoke of death tolls from disease and maltreatment, but did not refer to mass murder. The latter does not disprove mass murders by gassing at Auschwitz, and the former makes the absence of decoded Enigma messages irrelevant. A common mistake Holocaust deniers make is seizing upon and amplifying details that actually make the opposite point to the one they intend. For example, the interceptions from Auschwitz give figures on arrivals, departures, and deaths by natural causes and overwork, but they do not mention deaths from gassing or the arrival of those who were gassed. To a denier, this is evidence against gassing, but in context it presents a problem with the denier's whole thesis. If there are no records of transports of Jews that we know were sent to Auschwitz arriving at Auschwitz, or indeed arriving anywhere else, what happened to those transports and their passengers? We know they did not go into the general population of the camp because there is no record of them arriving. Other sources state that those destined for extermination were for the most part gassed immediately on arrival, so that makes sense. They were not processed, noted, tattooed, or anything else. They certainly did not show up in the encoded figures that were intercepted by British intelligence. So where did they go? Onward then to tweet number 4, and I quote, "The CIA was spying on German camps in the 1940s and did take aerial photographs. There is no evidence from these photographs or their reports that these camps were death camps. The labels on these photos were added decades later." Now, the CIA didn't exist until 1947, so they clearly weren't taking photographs in 1944, but we'll overlook that little detail. The pictures he links were taken by the South African Air Force, which extensively photographed the Auschwitz complex from Italy throughout the summer of 1944. You can see the gas chambers in the photographs he himself posted. In another picture taken by the Saffers, you can see bodies being burned in temporary pits next to Crematorium 5. When exactly labels were added to photographs is totally irrelevant. Onward then to tweet number 5, and I quote, "Paul Racinier was a French socialist who was also put in death camp at Buchenwald. He wrote a few books on his experiences, but he was considered a Holocaust denier even though he was a camp survivor. Why? His version of the facts didn't fit the narrative. He claimed the death camp allegations were incredibly exaggerated, and that while being a camp was a horrendous experience, it was not what is being sold today." Now, Paul Racinier, widely considered to be the father of Holocaust denial, was imprisoned at Buchenwald concentration camp for 3 weeks before being moved to Mittelbrau-Dora. Neither Buchenwald nor Dora was a death camp, and they did not have gas chambers. After the war, the frothing anti-Semite Racinier made a sorry career of Nazi apologetics and wrote a series of ahistorical books in which he claimed everyone but himself was biased and discounted the testimony of everyone who, unlike himself, had actually been in an extermination camp. He offers little evidence for his assertions and ignores all evidence to the contrary. He claimed to have received a number of decorations from the French state, of which there is absolutely no record. Racinier throws around altogether too much bullshit for the scope of this video, so I will refer you to the many reputable historians who have dealt with his lies at length, including Deborah Lipstadt and Nadine Fresco. Tweet number 6, and I quote, "There is no document or official order found anywhere in Nazi or SS communications about a final solution to eliminate the Jews. Decades ago, historian David Irving challenged anyone to find such a document with a reward of £1,000. No one has ever succeeded." I'll take this one backwards, giggity. Once respectable historian David Irving did not issue such a challenge. Mr. Irving offered £1,000 to anybody who could produce a written order from Hitler ordering the Holocaust. Had Mr. Irving offered a reward for any Nazi or SS communications about a final solution to eliminate the Jews, he would have lost his money very quickly, as there are a number of extremely famous documents to that effect. For example, the phrase is used 13 times in the minutes of the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, in which the intricacies of mass murder were worked out by mid-level functionaries of the Third Reich. We also have a letter from Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, among many other things, to Reinhard Heydrich, who was the SS chief Himmler's immediate deputy, charging him with bringing about a final solution to the Jewish question, widely considered to be the official political mandate for the Holocaust. For anybody who's interested in the role of Reichsmarshal Göring and the Luftwaffe more generally in the Holocaust, I would commend the book Birds of Prey by Philip W. Blood. Further, Reinhard Heydrich also uses the phrase final solution in a letter to German Foreign Office official Martin Luther in February 1942. I could go on. Typical of denier sloppiness, this is just easily falsified nonsense. Onward to tweet number 7, and I quote, "There was a swimming pool at Auschwitz, a maternity ward, a hospital, and lots of forensic reports of the use of Zyklon B in the prisoner rooms. No, not for extermination, but for the purpose of keeping the prisoners alive. This was used as means to eliminate lice and keep the spread of typhus under control. Among these SS communications, there are internal reports about keeping the death of inmates down and discussion on how to fix the problems." There wasn't a swimming pool at Auschwitz, but there were firefighting reservoirs, one of which had diving boards added and was used for a period of time by SS guards and certain privileged prisoners. Yes, there was a hospital at Auschwitz because it wasn't just a death camp, but it housed 1.3 million people during its existence. Of course there was a hospital. It's well known that Zyklon B, aka hydrogen cyanide, aka prussic acid, was used as a delousing agent. That is, after all, what it was manufactured for. It's also well known that it was used to gas people. As previously discussed, it's far better at killing people than it is at killing lice. As for the SS trying to keep death tolls low, of course the tweeter fails to provide the documents, so I cannot respond to that claim directly, but I would refer you to my previous point. Auschwitz housed 1.3 million people during its existence. It was predominantly housing for workers, a workforce used in the industries surrounding Auschwitz, so there may have been efforts by the SS to keep unnecessary deaths at a minimum. That does not, of course, discount the occurrence of mass murder at Auschwitz to Birkenau. Tweet number 8, and I quote, "The only death camps," there's those scare quotes again, "ever discovered were on the Soviet-captured side of Germany post-World War II, meaning that you have to trust the Soviet communist version of history in order to believe the official narrative." Now, this is straight-up fallacious reasoning and is also untrue. Holocaust history is not filtered through a Soviet lens. All of the respectable Holocaust historians I can think of are from Western countries or work in Western countries. In any case, if communists are not to be trusted, why does the tweeter trust the word of the communist Paul Rossinier? Tweet number 9. One of the initial death tolls from the Soviet camp Majdanek has been reduced from 2 million to 78,000. That's quite the revision, and many question the accuracy of that 78,000 figure based on historical records. Estimating historical death tolls is notoriously tricky, and different approaches can yield wildly different results. Now, the Soviet authorities, upon discovering and superficially investigating the camps, had a habit of stating how many people the camps could have killed given the facilities they found there, that is to say, a measure of capacity. This filtered westwards as death figures rather than speculative up-to type figures. In the case of Majdanek, there have indeed been various estimates. The official figure used by the Camp Museum is indeed 78,000, but this is far from universally accepted. A previous museum director estimates 235,000 and stands by that figure. The museum also states that 150,000 prisoners arrived at Majdanek during the 3 years of its existence, so it's safe to say the issue of the death toll at that particular camp is unsettled. I would point out, though, the tweeter dishonestly suggests that because there are people disputing the 78,000 figure, that all of them are disputing that figure downwards. That's simply untrue. Many of them dispute that figure upwards. Now, we shouldn't be surprised at any of this. One could write entire books trying to establish the death toll, for example, at the Somme, but that doesn't mean that the Battle of the Somme did not take place. This is simply fallacious reasoning. And so to tweet number 10, which is among the more ridiculous of the claims in this thread, which is frankly a pretty busy market. Now, I quote, tweet number 10, "At the height of the COVID epidemic," yeah, you knew he'd go there, didn't you? "Some New York crematoriums were working overtime and able to cremate up to 15 bodies a day. Obviously, you don't have to be a maths whiz to figure out that 80 years ago, the Germans would not have been able to do this faster, and it would have taken roughly 69 years to gas and cremate all of the alleged victims if they were to actually do it." Now, this is just absurd. Modern crematoriums are not the body-burning factories found in Nazi death camps, but facilities that hold funerals and dispose of remains in a respectful, ceremonial and religious way. It takes hours for New York's crematoriums to process a single body, whereas it's well documented that the 5 crematoriums at Auschwitz-Birkenau could each destroy up to 1,400 bodies per day. I'll not dignify this nonsense with any further analysis. Tweet number 11. "Didn't the Allies find tons of dead bodies at the camps they liberated? Yes. Nobody is saying that people didn't die. The reality is Germany was fighting a two-front war, running out of fuel, food and resources, and typhus was spreading through many of the camps. However, there is no physical evidence that these were extermination camps used for the purpose of killing Jews. Why would the Germans wait until the middle of a two-front war to do this? Hitler came to power in 1933. Hitler also signed the Havre Agreement with the Zionist leadership in 1933. The plan was to coordinate effort to relocate the Jews from Germany to Palestine and satisfy both parties. If Hitler wanted to kill all of the Jews, why did the Zionists work with him, and why did he sign this agreement?" Now, much like I am at this point, the tweeter may be running out of patience because this is just a bullshit fountain. Now, there is a wealth of physical evidence to that effect, not least of which is the camps themselves, some of which still stand and can be visited by tourists and historians. We also have the enormous numbers of documents, photographs, testimonies to that effect. Why did the Germans not start the Holocaust in 1933? Now, leaving aside the respectable argument that they did lay the groundwork as soon as they came to power, Germany did not control the territory where nearly all of the European Jews lived until they invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. And that is when the Holocaust began, and arguably why the Holocaust began. The Havre Agreement is interesting, but not for the reasons the tweeter thinks. Now, this agreement, which was signed in 1933, built upon earlier attempts by the German government to encourage Jews to emigrate to the Holy Land, what is now Israel. However, it came with spikes. After the Nazis came to power, one of the only ways for Jews to leave Germany was to pay ruinous fees to the government. Many would not pay these fees, or could not pay these fees, and so remained in Germany. The Nazis didn't like Jews very much, but they liked money more than they hated Jews, and those Jews who did want to remain often struggled to find countries that would accept them. So this inconvenient situation persisted. The Havre Agreement solved a number of these problems. Essentially, the deal was that the Jews who could afford it would deposit a medium-sized sum of money with a Palestinian trust company and emigrate. The trust company would then use the money to buy German-manufactured agricultural equipment and situate the emigrants on farms in Palestine. The fact that there was investment occurring got around the rather thorny visa issue. The British Empire that controlled the Holy Land at the time generally resisted Jewish immigration, but they would make exception for those who invested money there. Germany terminated the programme when they invaded Poland in 1939 for fairly obvious reasons. Now, the existence of the Havre Agreement does present a bit of a challenge to intentionalist scholars of the Holocaust, that is, those who believe that Hitler planned to exterminate the Jews from fairly early on, but it does not contradict the historical record in any way. Jews were allowed to leave if they could afford it. And then they were not allowed to leave, and then they were murdered. Various other options were considered too, such as relocating Jews to Madagascar, but in the end, as is well documented, the Nazi machinery settled on and carried out a policy of mass murder. Onward then to tweet number 12, and this is a long one. You'll note that as the tweeter gets more desperate, his tweets get longer and longer. And I quote, Aren't all the people that have questioned the official narrative of the Holocaust wackos and Nazis? No, not at all. Gemar Rudolph is a chemist who graduated from the prestigious Max Planck Institute. Fred Lucha is an American execution expert with multiple patents to his name. David Irving is a British historian who was lauded by the masses when his first books were released, and his ability to go through many first-hand documents only later to be destroyed by the mainstream press when he came across these uncomfortable facts. Arthur Butts is an MIT graduate who has been a college professor at Northwestern University for decades. His definitive book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, still holds up even though it was published in the 1970s. Many of these men have served prison time for these statements. They have not changed their belief or reports. Now, you'll see what the tweeter has done here. He has asked if Holocaust deniers are a bunch of wackos and Nazis, and then followed it up with a list of wackos and Nazis. Tweet number 13. But I've seen lots of movies and read books about eyewitness testimony. Some people have a hard time believing this, but Hollywood is not history, it is storytelling. Further, most of these stories are based on historical fiction, meaning the story cannot be completely made up as long as a few facts are found. Now, this is so poorly phrased that I'm just going to have to assume I've understood it correctly. If you think I've misinterpreted this tweet, please do mention it in the comments. But, this is just more fallacious reasoning. People write fictional and fictionalized books and make fictional and fictionalized films about the Holocaust. Full Metal Jacket was a work of fiction. That does not mean that the United States Marine Corps doesn't exist. Tweet number 14. There have been countless stories of Holocaust survivors, scare quotes, he likes those, later is exposed as frauds. While this technically doesn't disprove the official narrative, well done, he stumbled upon something true. It does provide a lens of the possibilities, because virtually all the Holocaust stories are based on eyewitness testimony. No, they're not physical evidence. It provides an easy window for anyone to make up these claims. In fact, many eyewitness testimonies do not correspond to physical evidence at all. Some witnesses describe how bodies being black and blue after being hit with Zyklon B. However, a person gassed with Zyklon B should have a red-pink body in the aftermath. He is, of course, correct to say that the existence of frauds does not disprove the historical record. Plenty of people have pretended to have been in the SAS or the Navy SEALs. That doesn't mean that nobody has. Now, I'll make a quick note about eyewitness testimony. If you ask a policeman or a barrister about eyewitness accounts, you'll be told that they are extremely unreliable. 3 people can witness exactly the same event and tell radically different versions of what occurred. That doesn't mean that they didn't witness the event, but that human observation and recall is often imperfect. Indeed, one of the remarkable things about Holocaust eyewitness testimony is not that there are falsehoods and contradictions, that's true of nearly all eyewitness testimony, but how consistent it actually is. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people from all sides of the Holocaust, so not just victims, but perpetrators, bystanders, etc., tell very similar stories that are corroborated by numerous other sources. If the tweeter were even slightly smart, he'd comment on this phenomenon. Why is Holocaust testimony so, perhaps even oddly, consistent? But he isn't, so he doesn't. Tweet number 15. We're nearly at the end. We're getting there, so stay with us, guys. So, let's quote. If the office story, I think he means the official story, really was a fraud, the people in control of the media would have to maintain the story for decades, and they would have to make it illegal to question it in most of the Western world, which they have. Ultimately, you have to determine if the physical evidence is real or if the eyewitness testimony is real. Are they jailing people because they are wrong or because they are right? Is it possible that the Jews would lie about this en masse? It says specifically in their holy book, the Talmud, that they can lie to the Gentiles, that is to say non-Jews. It is also strange that Protestant leader Martin Luther wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies in 1543. He tried desperately to convert them to Christianity, but ultimately discovered that it was hopeless and wrote about their behaviour. You know the media is lying to you. You know the history books are lies. Have you figured out who is doing the lying? Now, you'll note, as I have, that he's getting less and less coherent and more bullshit heavy. But as the Jews would say, it takes a certain chutzpah, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, to moan about being unable to promote Holocaust denial in a viral thread that promotes Holocaust denial. But let's break this nonsense down a little further. As is common with deniers, the tweeter makes hay over bans on Holocaust denial. I think it's important to stress that only one country bans Holocaust denial explicitly. I'll say that again. Only one country bans Holocaust denial explicitly, and that is Romania. Other countries with similar laws ban atrocity or genocide denial in general, without specific reference to the Holocaust. For example, in Austria, where many Holocaust deniers have fallen foul of the law, it is equally illegal to deny the crimes of, say, the Soviet Union or Serbia. Other countries, such as Canada, consider Holocaust denial to fall within the scope of hate speech. Only Israel's law specifically mentions the Jews. And neither are such laws the norm. 18 European countries and Israel have atrocity denial laws, and Canada covers it with hate speech provisions. That means that 174 countries do not ban atrocity denial, including the United Kingdom, Southern Ireland, Spain, the Nordics, all of the Balkans except Greece, Latvia, Estonia, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, all of the Middle East except Israel, all of Asia, all of Africa, and all independent countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. But this is a red herring, as the legality of Holocaust denial has no bearing on the historicity of the Holocaust. Just because expressing an idea is illegal, that does not make the idea factually correct. Now, I'll not comment on the Talmud, as I frankly know nothing about it, but this point seems to come straight from the medieval anti-Semitism playbook. I expect the tweeter also believes that the Jews make matzos from the blood of St. Hugh of Lincoln, etc., lizards and so forth. Perhaps a qualified Jewish listener could chime in on what the Talmud actually says on this topic and how mainstream Jewish clergy interpret it. And that's the end of the thread. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you learned as much as I did when making it. If you have any questions or comments, or you think I've got something wrong, please do leave a comment. Now, I'm trying to build something of a bullshit debunking channel, covering historical as well as contemporary disinformation. It really helps me if you like, share, subscribe, follow, comment, or all of the above. And of course, if you have any topics you'd like to see covered, please do let me know. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.